What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown. This is Heresy Financial, and today we're looking at the fact that global debt is almost at $300 trillion. That's a T, trillion, not billion. And that's such an astronomically large number that we have to talk about what that means, what the implications are of having a global debt number that is so high. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, guys, so $300 trillion. We're not quite there yet. We are almost there. We're at $296 trillion. And so it should very quickly hit that $300 trillion mark. Obviously, that's a record. We've never been anywhere close to that before. And a couple things that are important to note about this. Let me blow that image up for you so that you can see it better. We can see this is kind of, sorry for how blurry it is, but we can see this is kind of how much this has trended up recently, just over the last couple of years. Just a huge explosion in debt. Now, you might also be looking at this red line and thinking, okay, wait, but we can't just look at the total debt. We have to look at what percentage. You have to look at debt as a percentage of global GDP. That's true. And one of the most important places to look at that is the United States, because global reserve currency, it's, obviously it's going to make a big impact. And one thing that's important to remember about this number is that there's broad consensus among most economists, whether you're talking about, let's just say most economists, that 90% is right around a tipping point for when it becomes more debt for an economy becomes more negative for that economy's growth, versus when, let's say, a country has 10% debt to GDP or 20%, then they would get a boost, an economic boost from adding on that additional debt. But usually they say 90% is kind of the tipping point where it's kind of a two-edged sword, where you have to continue to grow that debt in order to service the old debt, service the cost of that old debt, but it's providing the more that debt pile grows, the less and less of a return you get on that debt in terms of GDP numbers. And we saw back in 2020, when we had a big spike in debt, we hit a record in the United States at almost 136% debt to GDP. So just astronomically high. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking, hey, that's great that we're coming down. We're only at 125% right now, and we can see globally we've experienced a drop in the debt percentage to GDP. Now, the reason for that is not actually that we're doing better than we were before. The reason for that is because it takes time for that new debt to kind of work its way throughout the economy and have an impact on GDP. So the first thing that we had was a massive explosion in debt as countries dealt with COVID in the ways that, in the various ways that they dealt with it. Massive explosion in debt, but you're not going to see an instantaneous effect on GDP from that massive explosion in debt. And so that's why, let's look at the US. You have this massive explosion here because all that's happened so far is the debt. And as that amount of debt, that explosion in debt, works its way throughout the economy, now you start to have it hit GDP numbers. So this isn't necessarily that we're improving economically. This is just that, hey, we've finally seen some of those dollars work their way throughout the economy. You expect this to happen. If it didn't, there'd be something even worse, going on. And so the other thing to note about this is that GDP numbers are largely engineered. Countries can, especially if they or when they control their own currency, countries can basically engineer their GDP numbers, and you can do this especially well in the United States, as it's the dollar's the global reserve currency. You can engineer your GDP numbers with government spending, government deficit spending that is financed by the central bank. In other words, if the government borrows money in order to spend in excess of what they can tax, so you've got a deficit there, and they were borrowing from the economy, you're not injecting new money into the economy. You're just, whether you're taxing or borrowing, you're borrowing it or taxing it from one person in the economy and handing that out to another person in the economy. So deficit spending is different. Deficit spending is not withdrawing dollars from over here in the economy and then putting them back in over here in the economy. Deficit spending that is financed by the central bank is actually expanding the total supply of money. And that's what we had here. So this massive explosion in debt, most of that was financed by the Federal Reserve, our central bank. And so those dollars work their way out into the economy and have an effect on GDP. But the reason why it's important to recognize that these numbers are kind of engineered through monetary expansion is that they're not real. They're not a sign of real economic growth. They're simply a recognition of the fact that there's new dollars in the system. And the other thing that is important to note about this massive amount of debt globally is that this is a debt load that can't be repaid. So imagine that you and I are hanging out and we order pizza for dinner. And I order a pizza for myself. It's got 8 slices, let's say. So I get my pizza, it's got 8 slices, and you, instead of ordering your own pizza, you just look at me and you say, hey, let me borrow some pizza from you, and I'll repay you later with the number of slices of pizza that I borrowed from you. I say, sure, fine. So I give you 4 slices of my pizza. I keep 4 slices for myself. Now you owe me 4 slices of pizza. Well, after you start to eat your pizza, you let me know that you actually don't have any money and you'll never be able to pay me back those slices of pizza. That is what is called a default. That's just a real default, not in both in nominal terms and in real terms. That's just a default. I've made a loan. I've got you've got a contractual obligation to give me back 4 slices of pizza. Now it's realized that can no longer take place. So we've got to figure out some other solution to move forward. But in the end, the lender is the one that got hurt on that, right? And now I don't have the pizza that I thought I was going to get back. That represents the currency not changing in relation to the amount of wealth, 4 slices of pizza, right? Now, instead, though, let's say that you do try and pay me back. And the way that you try and pay me back is by taking your last pizza slice, cutting it up into 4 pieces and giving me those back and saying, hey, look, I paid you back. I don't have, any more obligation because I owed you 4 slices of pizza. I gave you 4 slices of pizza back. In nominal terms, there's no default there. You paid me back exactly what the contract specified you would pay me back. 4 slices of pizza. There's no specification on how much pizza had to be contained in each of those slices. In a similar way, our global debt load right now at approximately 300 trillion, the global percentage to GDP is 350% or so, which basically just means that is a debt load that cannot be repaid globally. There is not enough wealth in order to for austerity or sale of assets or anything like that to pay back that debt that is owed in nominal terms. And so the only way around a straight up default, which is what really happens either way, right? Because the lender is not getting back what they lent either way. The only way around that to avoid just outright default is to default in real terms, but not in nominal terms, by printing away that debt load. And the pizza slices represent the number of currency units being paid back, and the amount of pizza in each of those slices represents the purchasing power contained in each of those pieces of currency that's been created out of thin air in order to pay that back. And so that's what's going to happen here either way. We don't have a way out of this that is not default in some sense. We have, as a world, and as each individual country, we have borrowed more than it is able to be repaid. And that is what debt is. There's no free lunch. Debt is taking purchasing power from the future and bringing it into the present. That is the definition of debt. And we've taken so much purchasing power from the future and brought it into the present that we don't have the ability for that borrowing to be productive enough to produce enough to where we can pay that back into the future. And so so we don't have a way out other than printing, which is going to result in the collapse of currencies. And there's always winners and losers. And in this case, it's most likely going to be the lenders. And if you think, well, that's fine by me because I'm not a lender, not so fast. Most people are lenders and they don't realize it. If you have money in a bank account, you're a lender. You're lending your money to that bank, who is then using your money and lending that out to others for their own purposes. If you have a pension or a 401k, likely you have mutual funds or you have bonds in those accounts. Those mutual funds probably have bonds in them. And so most people, without knowing, are lenders. Even if you're not, even if you just have own equity, many companies are lenders. And so the financial markets are so intertwined that you're not going to be able to escape any pain of a default spiral, really. And even if there's no default spiral from outright defaults, those real defaults, in even with just printing in order to pay that back, those work their way out through the system with asset prices exploding, but sometimes not enough in order to maintain purchasing power. So even if asset prices rise as a result of this, maybe they don't rise enough to maintain the purchasing power that you originally used to make that investment in the first place. So 300 trillion, massive debt to GDP numbers. And just because we see debt to GDP falling is not an indication that things are economically getting better, that there's real growth taking place. That's just a recognition of the fact that it takes time for newly created dollars to work their way throughout the system. So you have an explosion in debt at first, and then you have that debt to GDP number improve over the next couple of quarters as those new dollars work their way and increase that GDP number. Has nothing to do with real economic growth. Now, and finally, don't get me wrong here, I'm not pronouncing a doom and gloom deflationary death spiral to start anytime soon. I'm just recognizing, hey, we've borrowed from the future more than is possible to be repaid back in real terms, meaning that default in some sense is necessary, is inevitable. Normally these things take time, take a lot of time, and people see them coming so far in advance that by the time they happen, the typical thing is, a broken clock is right twice a day. So we'll see what happens. I think they inflate out of it, which is still default, but we shall see. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.